Jake Morrison woke up before sunrise, just like he had every day for the past 3 months. But today was different. Today he would either come home with a horse or walk back to his small cabin empty-handed. He reached under his thin mattress and pulled out a crumpled envelope containing every dollar he owned in the world. $237. That was it. He counted the bills one more time, hoping somehow the number would magically increase. It didn't. Jake had been saving this money for 6 months, skipping meals and taking on extra work wherever he could find it. His stomach growled, reminding him that yesterday's dinner had been nothing more than canned beans and stale bread. The morning air was crisp as Jake stepped outside his cabin. The place wasn't much to look at, just 4 walls and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. But it was all he could afford after losing his job at the Miller Ranch. That had been his own fault, he knew. When old Mr. Miller died, his son took over and decided he didn't need as many hands. Jake was one of the first to go. Without a horse, finding steady ranch work had become nearly impossible. Nobody wanted to hire a cowboy who had to walk to the job. Jake had tried everything, fixing fences, mucking stalls, even helping with hay deliveries. But these odd jobs barely paid enough to keep food on the table, let alone save for a horse. He looked at his boots as he walked down the dusty road toward town. The leather was cracked and worn thin at the heels. His jeans had patches on both knees, and his shirt had seen better days years ago. Jake knew exactly how he looked to other people. Poor, desperate, not the kind of man who belonged at a horse auction with serious buyers. The county fairgrounds came into view as the sun climbed higher. Even from a distance, Jake could see the fancy horse trailers lined up in neat rows. These weren't the beat-up trailers held together with baling wire that he was used to. These were the kind that cost more than most people made in a year, with matching trucks that gleamed in the morning light. As Jake got closer, he recognized some of the trucks. There was William Garrett's massive red pickup with his ranch logo on the side. Garrett owned the biggest spread in 3 counties and had more money than sense, according to most folks. His horses lived better than most people in a barn that looked more like a palace than a place for animals. Next to Garrett's truck sat the Hendersons' trailer. They ran cattle on over 10,000 acres and were known for paying top dollar for the best horses. Jake had worked for them briefly 2 summers ago, long enough to know they treated their help decent but expected perfection in return. Jake took a deep breath and walked through the gates. Almost immediately he felt the stares, conversations stopped mid-sentence as people noticed him. He heard the whispers starting up behind him as he passed. What's Jake Morrison doing here? He ain't got 2 nickels to rub together. Poor fella probably thinks he can pick up something cheap. Somebody should tell him this ain't a charity auction. Jake kept walking, his face burning with embarrassment, but his determination still strong. He had every right to be here, even if his bank account said otherwise. Money wasn't everything, even though it sure felt like it most days. The auction ring was already busy with people examining the horses. Jake watched from the back as potential buyers ran their hands along the animals' legs, checked their teeth, and asked detailed questions about breeding and training. These people knew what they were looking for, and they had the money to get it. A group of younger ranch hands spotted Jake and started snickering among themselves. One of them, Tommy Wilson, worked for Garrett and had always thought he was better than everyone else. "Hey boys, look who showed up," Tommy said loudly enough for others to hear. "Jake's here to buy himself a horse. Maybe he can get one of those stick horses from the kids section." The group burst into laughter. Jake clenched his fists but kept walking. He couldn't afford to get into a fight, not today. Today was too important. He found a spot along the fence where he could watch the proceedings without drawing more attention to himself. The first few horses to come up were beautiful animals, sleek quarter horses with perfect conformation and impressive bloodlines. The bidding was fierce, with prices climbing quickly into the thousands. Jake watched Garrett bid on a flashy bay gelding, going head-to-head with another wealthy rancher until the price hit $8,000. Garrett won, naturally. $8,000 was more than Jake had made in the past 2 years combined. As the morning wore on, Jake began to worry. Every horse that came through the ring was selling for far more than he could afford. Even the older horses with minor problems were going for more than his entire savings. Maybe Tommy Wilson was right. Maybe he didn't belong here. The auctioneer called for a lunch break, and the crowd began to disperse. Jake stayed by the fence, not wanting to spend money on overpriced fair food when he needed every dollar for a horse. His stomach complained, but he ignored it. He'd been hungry before. "You, Jake Morrison?" a voice said behind him. Jake turned to see an older man he didn't recognize. The stranger was dressed simply, but his clothes were clean and well maintained. There was something kind about his weathered face. "Yes, sir, that's me." "Thought so." "You worked for old Charlie Miller before he passed, didn't you?" "Yes, sir, I did," the man nodded. "Charlie spoke highly of you. Said you had a way with horses that couldn't be taught. Said you listened to them instead of just trying to boss them around." Jake felt a warm feeling in his chest. It had been a long time since anyone had said anything positive about his abilities. "Thank you, sir. Charlie was a good man to work for." That he was. The stranger looked around at all the fancy trucks and trailers. "This your first time at one of these big auctions?" "Yes, sir. Probably my last two, unless things change for me." The man chuckled. "Don't be so sure about that, son. Sometimes the best things come when you least expect them. You stick around for the afternoon session. There might be something there for you." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the man walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Jake wondered who he was and what he knew that others didn't. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Jake positioned himself where he could see clearly but stay out of the way. His money felt heavy in his pocket, and his heart was beating faster than usual. This was it. His one chance to change his situation. He just had to hope that somewhere in the remaining horses there was one that the wealthy buyers would overlook. One that he could afford. One that would give him back his life as a working cowboy. The auctioneer picked up his microphone and Jake held his breath. Whatever happened next would determine whether he walked home tonight as a horseman or remained a cowboy without a horse in a world that had no use for such a thing. The afternoon session started with more of the same. Beautiful horses, wealthy bidders, and prices that made Jake's head spin. He watched horse after horse sell for amounts that would have solved all his problems and then some. His hope was starting to fade when the auctioneer's voice changed tone. "Now, folks, we've got something a little different coming up," the auctioneer announced, shuffling through his papers. "This next animal has quite a story behind it. Found its way to us through some unusual circumstances." Jake noticed the crowd shift uncomfortably. When auctioneers started talking about stories and unusual circumstances, it usually meant problems. Big problems. "This here horse came to us from a traveling carnival that went out of business last month down in Texas," the auctioneer continued. "Now, he's a bit bigger than what most of you folks are used to, but he's sound and healthy according to our vet." The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Jake could hear snippets of conversation around him. "Carnival horse? What kind of nonsense is that? Probably some broken-down old nag they use for pony rides. This auction's going downhill fast." Then Jake heard the sound. Heavy hoofbeats, but different from anything he'd heard before. Each step seemed to shake the ground slightly. The crowd near the gate started backing up, and Jake could see why. The horse that emerged into the ring was absolutely massive. Jake had seen plenty of big horses in his time, but nothing like this. The animal stood at least 18 hands tall, maybe more. His coat was a deep, rich black with white markings on his face and legs. But it wasn't just his height that was impressive. This horse was built like a mountain. His chest was broad enough to use as a table, and his legs were thick as fence posts. The crowd fell completely silent. This wasn't what anyone had expected. "This is Thunder," the auctioneer said, his voice not quite as confident as before. "He's a Clydesdale cross, approximately 8 years old. As you can see, he's got some size to him." Some size was an understatement. Thunder was enormous. He made every other horse that had come through the ring look like a pony. But as Jake watched, he noticed something that the rest of the crowd seemed to be missing. Despite his intimidating size, Thunder wasn't acting aggressive or difficult. His ears were forward and his eyes were calm and intelligent. Now, I'll be honest with you folks, the auctioneer continued, clearly uncomfortable. This horse has been challenging to place. He requires special handling due to his size, and he's got an appetite to match his build. The carnival folks said he was gentle as a lamb, but he's just too big for most operations. Jake could see the problem immediately. Thunder wasn't just big, he was gigantic. Most barns wouldn't have stall doors tall enough for him. Regular horse trailers would be too small. Even finding tack that fit would be a nightmare. This horse would need everything custom made, and that meant money. Lots of money. William Garrett leaned over to one of his buddies and spoke loud enough for half the crowd to hear. That's not a horse, that's a damn elephant. Who in their right mind would want that thing? You go broke just feeding it. Others nodded in agreement. Someone else called out, "How much hay does that monster eat in a day?" The auctioneer tried to regain control. Now folks, let's remember that draft horses have been working alongside humans for centuries. This fellow here might be just what someone needs for heavy work, but the damage was done. Jake could see it in people's faces. They weren't seeing a horse anymore, they were seeing a problem. A very large, very expensive problem. Let's start the bidding at $500, the auctioneer announced. Silence. Jake looked around the ring. Not a single hand went up. These people who had been throwing around thousands of dollars all day suddenly couldn't find $500 for this magnificent animal. All right, let's try $300, the auctioneer said, his voice showing his frustration. Still nothing. Thunder stood quietly in the center of the ring, seemingly unbothered by the rejection. Jake noticed how the big horse kept his head low and moved slowly, almost as if he was trying to make himself appear smaller and less threatening. There was something about the way he carried himself that spoke to Jake. This wasn't a mean or difficult horse. This was an animal who had learned that his size made people uncomfortable, and he was doing his best to be as gentle as possible. $200, folks. Surely someone can see the value in this animal. Jake's heart started beating faster. $200 was almost exactly what he had in his pocket. But buying Thunder would mean betting everything on a horse that nobody else wanted. A horse that might be impossible to use for regular ranch work. He looked at Thunder again. Really studied him this time. The horse's conformation was actually quite good under all that size. His legs were straight and strong, his back was level, and his movement was surprisingly graceful for such a big animal. But more than that, there was something in Thunder's eyes that Jake recognized. It was the same look he'd seen in his own mirror lately, the look of someone who had been written off by the world but still had plenty to offer. $150, the auctioneer called out, desperation creeping into his voice. This is basically giving him away, folks. That's when Jake noticed something that made his decision for him. Thunder had spotted him in the crowd, and the big horse was looking directly at him. Not at the other people who were pointing and laughing. But at Jake, it was as if Thunder could somehow sense that Jake was different from the rest. Tommy Wilson chose that moment to make another loud comment. Look at that thing. It's like something out of a fairy tale. Maybe we should call it the friendly giant? His friends laughed, but Jake barely heard them. He was too focused on Thunder, who was still watching him with those intelligent, gentle eyes. The auctioneer was getting ready to pass on the lot entirely when Jake did something that surprised even himself. He raised his hand. "I've got a bid," the auctioneer said, relief evident in his voice. $150 from the gentleman in the back. The crowd turned to see who had made the bid, and Jake felt every eye in the place land on him. The whispers started immediately. "Is that Jake Morrison? What's he thinking? That poor fool doesn't know what he's getting into. Wait, is that the broke cowboy we were laughing at earlier?" Jake ignored them all. His attention was completely focused on Thunder, who seemed to understand that something important was happening. The big horse took a step toward Jake's side of the ring as much as his lead rope would allow. "Do I hear 200? The auctioneer asked hopefully. Silence fell over the crowd again. Nobody was willing to bid against Jake, not because they respected him, but because they thought he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Going once at $150, the auctioneer called. Jake's mouth was dry. And this was it, his last chance to back out and save his money for a more practical horse. But something in Thunder's eyes told him this was right. Going twice. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see if anyone would save Jake from his own foolishness. Sold to bidder number 47 for $150. The sound of the gavel echoed through the ring, sealing Jake's fate. He had just spent nearly every dollar he owned on a horse that the experts said was useless. The laughter started before the sound of the gavel had even faded. The laughter hit Jake like a physical blow. It started with Tommy Wilson and his crew, but quickly spread through the entire crowd like wildfire. People who had been politely ignoring Jake all day were now openly pointing at him and shaking their heads in disbelief. Did that fool really just spend his last dollar on that circus freak? Someone called out loud enough for everyone to hear. Jake felt his face burning red, but he forced himself to walk toward the payment window. Each step felt like it took forever, with the laughter and comments following him the entire way. Somebody should have stopped him, an older woman said to her husband. That poor boy just threw away his future. Can't fix stupid, or her husband replied with a chuckle. At the payment window, the clerk looked at Jake with a mixture of pity and confusion. That'll be $150, plus the $20 handling fee, she said quietly. Jake's hands shook slightly as he counted. Out the bills. $170. That left him with exactly $67 to his name. $67 to last until he could figure out how to make money with Thunder. You sure about this, honey? The clerk asked, her voice gentle. That's an awful lot of horse for someone in your situation. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. He signed the paperwork and took the lead rope receipt. Thunder was officially his now, for better or worse. Behind him, William Garrett was holding court with a group of other wealthy ranchers, his voice carrying clearly across the area. I've seen some foolish decisions in my time, but that takes the cake, Garrett announced. That boy just bought himself a one-way ticket to bankruptcy. That animal will eat more in a month than Jake makes in 3. The group around Garrett laughed appreciatively. These were men who could afford to lose more money in a bad poker game than Jake had just spent on Thunder, and they found his situation hilarious. What's he gonna do with it? Asked Henry Patterson, who owned the second largest ranch in the county. That thing's too big for cattle work? Too big for most barns? Heck, it's too big for most trailers. Maybe he can rent it out for kids' birthday parties, Garrett suggested, causing another round of laughter. Charge them to ride the giant horse. Jake pretended not to hear as he made his way toward the holding pens where Thunder was waiting. But the comments kept coming from all directions. There goes Jake Morrison and his financial suicide, someone whispered, not bothering to keep their voice down. Poor fella probably thinks he got a deal. That horse is gonna eat him out of house and home in a week. When Jake reached Thunder's pen, he found the big horse standing calmly in the corner, seemingly unbothered by all the commotion around him. Thunder lifted his massive head when he saw Jake approaching, and those intelligent eyes seemed to study his new owner carefully. Hey there, big guy, Jake said softly, reaching out to touch Thunder's neck. The horse's coat was softer than he'd expected, and Thunder leaned slightly into the touch. Looks like it's just you and me now. Thunder nickered quietly, a surprisingly gentle sound for such a large animal. Jake felt some of his anxiety fade. Maybe everyone else was wrong. Maybe he'd just made the best decision of his life. That feeling lasted about 5 minutes. Jake Morrison, what in the world have you done? Jake turned to see Carl Henderson walking toward him, shaking his head in dismay. Carl was one of the more decent ranchers in the area, someone who had always treated Jake fairly when he'd worked. For them, I bought myself a horse, Mr. Henderson. Son, that's not a horse. That's a disaster waiting to happen. Carl looked at Thunder with the expression of someone examining a car wreck. Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into? He seems gentle enough, Jake said, though his confidence was starting to waver. Gentle's got nothing to do with it, Carl explained. Look at the size of that animal. Your little cabin probably isn't even tall enough for him to stand up straight in the barn area. How are you going to transport him? My biggest trailer wouldn't handle a horse that size. Jake hadn't thought about transportation. In fact, now that Carl mentioned it, he hadn't thought about a lot of practical things. He'd been so focused on the connection he felt with Thunder that he'd ignored all the obvious problems. And the feed bills, Carl continued. A horse that size probably eats 3 times what a normal horse does, maybe 4 times. You got the money for that kind of expense? Jake's stomach sank. He didn't have money for regular horse feed, let alone enough for an animal Thunder's size. Word of Jake's purchase was spreading fast through the auction grounds. Every few minutes, someone new would walk by just to get a look at the circus horse and the fool who bought it. Tommy Wilson showed up with his entire crew, all of them grinning like they'd just heard the best joke of their lives. Well, Tommy drawled. If it isn't Jake Morrison, proud owner of the world's most expensive pet elephant. His friends burst out laughing. One of them, a young cowboy named Pete, slapped his knee dramatically. I heard William Garrett say that thing eats about 100 pounds of hay a day, Pete announced. That's gonna cost you about $15 daily just in feed. How long you think $67 is gonna last you, Jake? Jake's heart sank. Even further. He hadn't realized his remaining money was common knowledge, but apparently word traveled fast in a small community. Maybe you can get a job at the zoo, Tommy suggested. They might need someone to shovel elephant droppings. The group dissolved into laughter again and moved on, but not before each of them took one more long look at Thunder, shaking their heads in amazement at Jake's stupidity. As the afternoon wore on, Jake began to realize just how big a problem he had created for himself. Every practical concern that people raised was valid. He didn't have a trailer big enough for Thunder. He didn't have a barn with high enough doors. He didn't have money for the massive amount of feed Thunder would need. He barely had money for his own food. The worst part was watching how people looked at him now. Before, when he was just a broke cowboy, people had ignored him or felt sorry for him. Now, they looked at him like he was the town idiot who had just proven exactly how stupid he really was. Around 4 o'clock, Jake borrowed a phone from the auction office to call every trailer rental place within 50 miles. The conversation was the same every time. How tall is the horse? They would ask, about 18 hands. We don't have anything that will handle an animal that size. You might try calling down to the livestock transport companies, but that's gonna cost you serious money. After the 6th failed call, Jake was starting to panic. How was he supposed to get Thunder home if he couldn't find a way to transport him? That's when he remembered old Pete Martinez, who lived about 10 miles outside town. Pete had an ancient livestock trailer that he used for hauling cattle. It was beat up and rusty, but it was tall and wide. Maybe, just maybe, it would work. The phone call to Pete was Jake's last hope. You bought what? Pete asked when Jake explained the situation. A big horse, really big. Pete was quiet for a long moment. Jake, you know I like you, son, but I ain't risking my trailer for some crazy experiment. What if that giant horse kicks? The sides out? What if he's too heavy for the axles? Please, Pete, I'm desperate here. Another long pause. All right, but you're paying for any damage, and I mean any damage at all. And you're paying me $50 for the use of the trailer. $50. That would leave Jake with $17 to his name. But what choice did he have? Deal, Jake said, though the word felt like swallowing glass. As Jake hung up the phone, he heard William Garrett's voice booming across the auction grounds one more time. That Morrison boy just provided us all with the best entertainment we've had in years, Garrett announced to anyone who would listen. I can't wait to see how this story ends. My guess is he'll be trying to give that monster away within a week. The laughter that followed Garrett's comment echoed in Jake's ears as he walked back to Thunder's pen. The big horse was still standing quietly, waiting patiently for whatever came next. Jake reached out and patted Thunder's neck again, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Pete Martinez arrived at the auction grounds just as the sun was starting to set. His old trailer looked even worse than Jake remembered, rusty, dented, and held together with what appeared to be prayer and baling wire. But it was tall enough, and wide enough for Thunder, and right now, that made it the most beautiful sight Jake had ever seen. "You sure about this, Jake?" Pete asked as he backed the trailer up to the loading area. "That horse looks even bigger in person than you described?" On the phone, Thunder stood calmly beside Jake, seeming to understand that something important was happening. The big horse had been nothing but patient all day, despite the pointing, laughing, and general commotion around him. "We'll make it work," Jake said. Though he wasn't entirely sure how, loading Thunder turned out to be surprisingly easy. The big horse walked right up the ramp without hesitation, ducking his head slightly to fit through the opening. Once inside, he stood perfectly still while Jake secured the safety chains. "Well, I'll be," Pete muttered. "Most horses give you trouble loading, especially into a strange trailer. This one acts like he's done it 1,000 times. The ride back to Jake's cabin was nerve-wracking. Every bump in the road made Jake worry about Thunder's safety, and the old trailer creaked and groaned under the weight. But Thunder seemed completely unbothered, riding quietly without any of the pawing or restlessness that nervous horses usually showed during transport. When they finally reached Jake's property, the sun had completely set. In the dim light from Pete's headlights, Jake's cabin looked even smaller and more run-down than usual. The little lean-to structure he'd been calling a barn looked like a dollhouse compared to Thunder. "Jake, there's no way that horse is fitting in there," Pete said, pointing at the makeshift shelter. Jake's heart sank. Pete was absolutely right. The lean-to had been built for regular-sized horses, with a roof that would come right to Thunder's ears. There was no way the big horse could stand comfortably inside. "I guess we'll have to figure something else out," Jake said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. They unloaded Thunder in the small paddock beside the cabin. Even in the dim light, Jake could see how cramped the space looked with such a massive animal in it. Thunder explored his new surroundings calmly, sniffing the fence posts and water trough. After Pete left with his $50, Jake found himself standing alone in his yard with $17 in his pocket and a horse that was bigger than his living room. The reality of his situation hit him like a punch to the gut. What had he been thinking? Thunder wandered over to where Jake was standing and gently nudged his shoulder with his massive nose. The touch was surprisingly soft, and Jake reached up to stroke the horse's face. "Well, big guy, looks like we're both in a mess now," Jake said quietly. "I hope you know something I don't, because I'm all out of ideas." Thunder seemed to study Jake's face in the moonlight, those intelligent eyes reflecting a wisdom that Jake found oddly comforting. There was something about this horse that was different from any animal he'd ever worked with. It wasn't just the size, it was the way Thunder seemed to understand things. The first night was rough. Jake couldn't bring himself to put Thunder in the too small lean-to, so he left the big horse loose in the paddock. He barely slept, getting up every hour to check on Thunder through his cabin window. Each time, he found the horse standing quietly, never trying to escape or cause trouble. When morning came, Jake discovered the first sign that Thunder was truly special. The water trough, which Jake had filled the night before, was completely empty. But instead of making a mess by splashing water everywhere like most horses did, Thunder had somehow managed to drink without spilling a single drop. Even more surprising, the big horse had eaten every bit of the hay Jake had given him, but had somehow arranged the leftover stems in a neat pile in one corner of the paddock. "That's not normal horse behavior," Jake muttered to himself as he refilled the water trough. Thunder watched Jake work and seemed to anticipate his needs. When Jake went to move the water trough to a better position, Thunder stepped aside before Jake even asked him to move. When Jake dropped his gloves, Thunder gently picked them up with his teeth and held them out. "How did you know to do that?" Jake asked, amazed. Over the next few days, Jake began to understand just how remarkable Thunder really was. The big horse seemed to have an almost human-like intelligence. He learned Jake's daily routine within 2 days and would position himself at the gate each morning exactly when Jake came out to feed him. But the most amazing discovery came on the 3rd day. Jake had been struggling to fix a broken board in the paddock fence, trying to hold the board in place while hammering nails. It was a job that really needed two people, but Jake couldn't afford to hire help. Thunder watched Jake's struggles for a few minutes, then did something that made Jake's jaw drop. The big horse carefully positioned himself next to the fence and used his chest to hold the board steady while Jake hammered. When Jake moved to the next nail, Thunder shifted his position to keep the board perfectly aligned. "Did you just help me fix this fence?" Jake asked in amazement. Thunder nickered softly as if to say, "Of course." Word about Thunder's unusual intelligence began to spread, though not in a way that helped Jake's reputation. People who came by to see the circus horse left shaking their heads and telling stories that made Jake sound even crazier. "That Morrison boy has lost his mind," reported Mrs. Johnson from the general store. "He's talking to that giant horse like it's a person and swears the thing talks back to him." "I heard he's got the horse doing tricks," added Bill Peterson. "Probably thinks he can start his own circus." But Jake didn't care what people said anymore. Every day, Thunder showed him something new. The big horse could open gate latches with his nose, something Jake discovered when he found Thunder standing in the yard. One morning, despite being sure he'd secured the gate the night before, Thunder also seemed to understand that Jake was struggling financially. Without being asked, the big horse began eating more slowly and carefully, wasting nothing. He would even sort through his hay, eating the coarse stems that most horses left behind. One morning, Jake woke up to find Thunder standing at the cabin door, holding Jake's work gloves in his mouth. It took Jake a moment to realize what had happened. Thunder had somehow sensed that Jake was about to oversleep and had come to wake him up for a job interview Jake had scheduled in town. "How did you know?" Jake asked, taking the gloves from Thunder's gentle mouth. "The job interview was for part-time work at a feed store. It didn't pay much, but it would be enough to keep food on the table and hay in Thunder's belly." During the interview, Jake found himself telling the store owner about Thunder's remarkable behavior. "Sounds like you've got quite an animal there," the owner said. "Most horses are pretty smart, but what you're describing sounds almost supernatural." "I know how it sounds," Jake admitted. "But I'm telling you, this horse is different." Jake got the job, partly because the owner was curious about Thunder, and partly because Jake was willing to work for less money than other applicants. It wasn't much, but it was a start that evening. As Jake sat on his cabin steps watching Thunder graze in the paddock, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. People could laugh all they wanted, but Jake knew he had something special. Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was a partner. Thunder seemed to sense Jake's improved mood. The big horse wandered over and gently rested his massive head on Jake's shoulder, a gesture so human-like that it took Jake's breath away. "I don't know what's going to happen to us, big guy," Jake said, scratching Thunder behind the ears. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." As if he understood every word, Thunder nickered softly and stayed close to Jake until long after the stars came out. For the first time since the auction, Jake went to sleep feeling like maybe, just maybe, he hadn't made the biggest mistake of his life after all. Jake had been working at the feed store for 3 weeks when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, and he was stacking 50-pound bags of horse feed when a stranger walked through the door. The man was tall and weathered, with the kind of deep tan that came from spending years working outdoors. His clothes were practical but expensive, the kind of gear that serious outdoorsmen wore. "Morning," the stranger said, approaching the counter where Jake's boss, Roy Campbell, was working on paperwork. "I'm looking for someone who might know about draft horses in this area." Roy looked up from his invoices. "Draft horses? Well, that depends on what you need them for. Most folks around here use quarter horses for ranch work." "I'm with Mountain View Logging Company," the man explained, pulling out a business card. "We've got a contract to clear timber from some pretty steep terrain up in the national forest. The land's too rough for our machinery, and we need horses that can handle heavy loads on dangerous ground." Jake's ears perked up. He'd heard about logging operations that still used horses for specialized work, but he'd never seen one in person. "The problem is," the man continued, "we've tried using regular horses, but they're just not big enough for what we need. We've had 3 horses injured in the past month trying to move logs that were too heavy for them. My insurance company is threatening to drop us if we don't find a better solution. Roy scratched his head. I'm not sure I can help you there. Nobody around here keeps draft horses anymore. They're just too expensive to maintain for regular farm work. The stranger, who had introduced himself as Frank Morrison, the logging company's foreman, looked disappointed. We're getting desperate. This contract is worth more than $500,000, but we can't complete it without the right horses. We've tried bringing in equipment from the flatlands, but it keeps breaking down on the rough terrain. Jake continued stacking feed bags, but his mind was racing. Thunder was exactly the kind of horse this man was describing. Big enough to handle. Heavy loads, sure-footed, and gentle enough to work safely around people. But would Jake dare to suggest it? What kind of money are you talking about for the right horse and handler? Roy asked, curious despite himself. Frank's answer made Jake nearly drop the bag he was holding. For the right team, we're paying $300 a day. The job would probably take about 2 months to complete, maybe 3 if the weather doesn't cooperate. Jake did quick math in his head. $300 a day for 60 to 90 days. That was more money than he'd made in the past 2 years combined. $300 a day? Roy repeated, equally stunned. That's serious money. It's serious work, Frank replied. These logs weigh anywhere from 500 to 2,000 pounds each. They have to be dragged down steep hillsides without damaging the surrounding forest. One mistake could kill a man or a horse, so we need animals that are completely reliable and handlers who know what they're doing. Jake's heart was pounding. This was the opportunity he'd been praying for, but it was also terrifying. He'd never done logging work before, and the stakes were obviously high. But Thunder's size and intelligence made him perfect for this kind of job. Roy was about to tell Frank that he couldn't help when Jake finally found the courage to speak up. Excuse me, sir, Jake said, setting down the feed bag and walking over to the counter. I might know someone who could help you. Frank looked Jake up and down, taking in his worn clothes and work-stained hands. You know someone with draft horses? I know someone with a horse that might be exactly what you're looking for, Jake said carefully. He's big enough to handle heavy loads, and he's the smartest horse I've ever seen. Problem is, most people think he's too big to be useful. Frank's interest was clearly piqued. How big are we talking? About 18 hands, maybe a little more. He's a Clydesdale cross. Roy stared at Jake in surprise. He knew Jake had bought a horse at the auction, but he hadn't realized what kind of animal it was. Where did you find a Clydesdale cross around here? Frank asked. Jake felt his face flush. I bought him at the county auction a few weeks ago. People said I was crazy, but I saw something in him that others missed. Frank studied Jake more carefully. You're the handler? Yes, sir, and I can tell you that this horse is special. He's not just big, he's smart and gentle and seems to understand. Exactly what you need from him. I'd like to see this horse, Frank said. When would be a good time? Jake's mouth went dry. This was it, his chance to prove that buying Thunder wasn't the biggest mistake of his life. But what if Thunder didn't perform well? What if Frank took one look at Jake's tiny operation and laughed just like everyone else had? You could come by this afternoon if you want, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. I live about 10 miles outside town, Frank nodded. Give me directions. I'll be there around 2 o'clock. After Frank left, Roy looked at Jake with a mixture of amazement and concern. Jake, that's a lot of money they're talking about, but it's also dangerous work. You sure you know what you're getting into? I've been around horses my whole life, Jake said, and Thunder, he's different. I think he could handle it. It's not just about the horse, Roy warned. Logging work is some of the most dangerous work there is. Men get killed doing that job. Jake understood the risks, but he also understood that this might be his only chance to change his life. If he could prove Thunder's worth on this job, word would spread. Other opportunities would follow. The rest of the morning dragged by slowly. Jake could barely concentrate on his work, constantly checking the clock and wondering what Frank would think when he saw Thunder at noon. Jake asked Roy if he could leave early to prepare for the meeting. Roy agreed, partly out of curiosity. and partly because he could see how important this was to Jake. Jake drove home faster than he probably should have, his mind racing with all the things that could go wrong. What if Thunder didn't cooperate? What if Frank decided the horse was too big and unpredictable? What if Jake's inexperience with logging work was too obvious? When he arrived at his cabin, Thunder was standing at the gate as if he'd been waiting. The big horse nickered softly when he saw Jake, and seemed to sense that something important was happening. "We've got a visitor coming, big guy," Jake said, opening the gate and leading Thunder into the yard. "This could change everything for us, but you're going to have to show him what you can do." Thunder stood quietly while Jake brushed his coat until it gleamed in the afternoon sun. For the first time since the auction, Jake felt proud of his horse. Thunder was magnificent, powerful, intelligent, and gentle. Surely Frank would see what Jake saw. At exactly 2 o'clock, a dusty pickup truck pulled into Jake's driveway. Frank got out slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the modest cabin, the small paddock, and finally settling on Thunder. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Frank walked around Thunder slowly, examining him from every angle. Thunder stood, perfectly still, seeming to understand that he was being evaluated. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank finally said. "You weren't kidding about the size. He's the biggest horse I've ever seen." "He's gentle as a lamb," Jake said quickly. "Watch this." Jake walked over to Thunder and placed his hand on the horse's massive chest. Without any verbal command, Thunder immediately backed up 3 steps, then stopped. Jake held up his hand, and Thunder lifted his right front hoof. Another gesture, and Thunder lowered his head so Jake could scratch behind his ears. Frank watched the display with growing amazement. "How long have you two been working together?" "Only about a month," Jake admitted. "But it's like he can read my mind sometimes." Frank approached Thunder slowly, extending his hand for the horse to sniff. Thunder gently touched Frank's palm with his nose, then stood quietly while the foreman examined his legs and hooves. "His conformation is excellent," Frank said, more to himself than to Jake. "Legs are straight and strong. Feet are in good shape. How's his temperament around loud noises?" "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "We haven't been around much noise out here." Frank walked back to his truck and returned with a small air horn. "Mind if I test something?" Jake nodded, though his heart was beating fast. Frank moved about 20 feet away from Thunder and sounded the air horn. The loud blast echoed across the yard. Thunder's ears flicked toward the sound, but he didn't move. He simply looked at Frank with calm, intelligent eyes, as if to say, "Is that all you've got?" Frank smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Most horses would have spooked and run. This one acts like he's been around construction equipment his whole life. "So what do you think?" Jake asked, hardly daring to hope. Frank was quiet for another moment, clearly weighing his options. "The horse is impressive, I'll give you that. But I'm taking a big risk here. This job can't afford any mistakes." "Give us a chance," Jake said. "If we don't work out, you can send us home. But I think Thunder could be exactly what you're looking for." Frank looked at Thunder one more time, then extended his hand to Jake. "All right, son. You've got yourself a job. We start Monday morning?" Monday morning came faster than Jake had expected. He was up before dawn, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror. This was it, his chance to prove that buying Thunder wasn't the biggest mistake of his life. But as he loaded Thunder into Pete's borrowed trailer once again, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. The logging site was about an hour's drive into the mountains, up a winding dirt road that got narrower and steeper with each mile. When they finally arrived at the work camp, Jake's jaw dropped. The operation was massive, dozens of workers, heavy equipment, and piles of logs that looked like they belonged in a giant's backyard. Frank met them at the gate, wearing a hard hat and carrying a clipboard thick with paperwork. "Morning, Jake. Ready to see what we're dealing with?" Jake nodded, though ready was the last thing he felt. Thunder, on the other hand, seemed completely calm as they unloaded him from the trailer. The big horse looked around the busy worksite with curious eyes, showing no signs of nervousness despite all the noise and activity. "First thing you need to understand," Frank explained as they walked toward the work area, Is that safety comes? First, second, and third. One wrong move up here can kill someone. Your horse spooks and runs, someone could get crushed by a rolling log. Jake swallowed hard. Thunder doesn't spook easily. We'll see about that, Frank said. Today's going to be a test run. If your horse can handle what we throw at him, you're hired. If not, no hard feelings, but you'll be heading home. The test area was a steep hillside covered with fallen trees. Some of the logs were enormous, easily over 6 feet in diameter, and 30 feet long. Other horses were already working, but Jake could see immediately why Frank needed something bigger. The regular-sized horses were struggling, working in teams of 2 or 3 just to move the smaller logs. See that log there? Frank pointed to a massive oak trunk about halfway up the hillside. That one weighs about 1,800 pounds. We've been trying to get it down for 3 days, but it's too much for our current teams. Jake looked at the log, then at Thunder. The big horse was studying the hillside too, almost like he was calculating something. What exactly do you want? Is yours to do? Jake asked. Simple. Get that log from where it is to the loading area down here, Frank said. But remember, we can't damage the smaller trees around it. This is national forest land, and we have strict environmental rules to follow. Jake felt his mouth go dry. The hillside was steep and rocky, with young trees scattered everywhere. 1. Wrong step could send Thunder tumbling, or worse, could cause the massive log to roll out of control. Don't worry, Frank added, seeing Jake's expression. We'll start with something smaller. Let's see how your horse handles the basic equipment first. Frank led them to a collection of harnesses and chains that looked like they belonged in a medieval torture chamber. The logging harness was enormous, designed for the biggest draft horses, but even so, it barely fit Thunder's massive frame. This is going to be interesting, muttered Danny, one of the other horse handlers. I've never seen a horse that big try to work these hills. Thunder stood perfectly still while Jake and Frank fitted the harness around his chest and shoulders. The big horse seemed to understand exactly what was happening, even extending his legs to make the process easier. Good sign, Frank said approvingly. Most horses fight the harness the first time. They started with a relatively small log only, about 8 feet long and maybe 500 pounds. For Thunder, it was like pulling a stick. The big horse leaned into the harness and moved the log down the hillside so smoothly that it looked effortless. Well, I'll be damned, Danny said, shaking his head in amazement. That horse just moved that log like it was nothing. But Frank wasn't satisfied with easy tests. Let's try something bigger. The next log was twice the size, over 1,000 pounds and awkwardly shaped. This time, the path down the hillside was more complicated, winding between standing trees and over. Rocky ground. Jake attached the chains to the log and stepped back. Okay, Thunder, nice and easy. What happened next left everyone speechless. Thunder didn't just pull the log, he seemed to think about the best route down the hillside. The big horse would stop, look ahead, then adjust his position to avoid obstacles. When the log started to swing toward a young tree, Thunder somehow sensed it and corrected his path without any guidance from Jake. Did that horse just plan his own route? Asked Bobby, another worker who had stopped to watch. Frank was taking notes on his clipboard, his expression growing more amazed by the minute. Jake, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like your horse understands exactly what he's supposed to do. The real test came when Frank pointed to the massive oak log that had been giving them trouble all week. Think your horse can handle that one? Jake looked up the steep hillside at the enormous log. It was easily the biggest piece of timber he'd ever seen, and the path down was treacherous, steep, rocky, and filled with obstacles. We can try, Jake said, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. Getting to the log was an adventure in itself. Thunder picked his way up the rocky hillside with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, despite his enormous size. When they reached the fallen oak, Jake could see why it had been such a problem. The log was wedged between 2 standing trees and positioned at an angle that made it dangerous to move. Thunder studied the situation for several minutes, walking around the log and examining it from different angles. Then he did something that made Jake's heart skip a beat. The big horse positioned himself uphill from the log, in a spot that would give him maximum leverage but also put him in the most dangerous position if something went wrong. "Thunder, are you sure about this?" Jake asked quietly. The big horse looked back at Jake with those intelligent eyes, and Jake could swear he saw confidence there. Thunder knew exactly what he was doing. Jake hooked up the chains with shaking hands. If this went wrong, Thunder could be crushed or sent tumbling down the mountainside. But something told him to trust his horse's judgment. "Okay, big guy. Your show." Thunder leaned into the harness, and Jake felt the chains go tight. For a moment, nothing happened. The log was so heavy and so wedged in place that it seemed impossible to move. Then, slowly, incredibly, the massive oak began to shift. Thunder didn't just pull, he worked the log like a puzzle piece, using his weight and positioning to free it from the trap it was caught in. When the log finally broke loose, Thunder immediately adjusted his stance and began guiding it down the hillside. The descent was like watching a master at work. Thunder seemed to anticipate every obstacle, every dangerous spot where the log might roll out of control. He would pause at difficult sections, repositioning himself to maintain perfect control of the massive timber. When they finally reached the bottom, the entire work crew was watching in stunned silence. Thunder had just accomplished in 30 minutes what teams of horses had been trying to do for 3 days. Frank was the first to speak. "Jake, I don't know where you found this horse, but he's not normal." "That was the most incredible piece of horse work I've ever seen." Danny nodded in agreement. "I've been working with horses for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. It's like he's got a computer in his head, calculating angles and weights and everything." As word spread through the camp about Thunder's performance, workers started gathering around to get a look at the giant horse who had solved their biggest problem. Thunder stood quietly, accepting the attention with the calm dignity that Jake had come to expect from him. Frank pulled Jake aside as the crowd dispersed. "Son, I came into this thinking I was doing you a favor by giving you a chance. Now I realize you're doing me the favor. That horse of yours is going to revolutionize how we handle the big timber." "So we've got the job?" Jake asked, hardly daring to believe it. "You've got the job," Frank confirmed. 300 a day, just like we discussed. And Jake, after seeing what I saw today, I'm thinking we might need to renegotiate that rate upward." As Jake led Thunder back to the trailer at the end of the day, he felt like he was walking on air. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt proud of himself and his decisions. Thunder had proven that sometimes the best investments are the ones that everyone else thinks are crazy. The big horse seemed to sense Jake's happiness. As they loaded up for the trip home, Thunder gently nudged Jake's shoulder with his nose, as if to say, "I told you so." 6 months after that first day at the logging site, Jake's life had completely changed. He woke up each morning in a real bed instead of on a thin mattress on the floor. His new cabin was 3 times the size of his old one, with electricity that worked and plumbing that didn't leak. Most importantly, Thunder now had a proper barn with doors tall enough for him to walk through comfortably. The money from the logging job had been better than Jake ever imagined. $300 a day had quickly turned into $400. When Frank realized how much time Thunder was saving the operation, other logging companies started calling, offering even more money for Jake and Thunder's services. Word was spreading fast through the industry about the cowboy with the giant horse who could move logs that entire teams couldn't handle, but the real change wasn't just in Jake's bank account, it was in how people treated him. The same folks who had laughed at him 6 months ago now spoke to him with respect, even admiration. When Jake drove into town, people would wave and call out greetings. The local bank manager, who had once looked at Jake like he was going to rob the place, now personally handled his accounts and offered him investment advice. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jake drove his new truck into the county courthouse parking lot. He wasn't there for any legal trouble, quite the opposite. He was there to file the paperwork for his new business, Morrison Heavy Logging Services. What had started as a desperate gamble was now a legitimate company with more work offers than Jake could handle. As he walked up the courthouse steps, Jake spotted a familiar figure coming down. It was Tommy Wilson, the young cowboy who had led the laughter at the auction 6 months earlier. Tommy looked the same as always, cocky and well-dressed in expensive cowboy gear that his boss William Garrett provided for all his hands. "Well, well," Tommy said, blocking Jake's path with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "If it isn't Jake Morrison, the famous horse whisperer." "Tommy," Jake nodded politely, trying to step around him. "Heard you've been making some money with that circus horse of yours," Tommy continued. "Folks are saying you're charging premium prices for what any good horse team could do." Jake stopped walking. 6 months ago, Tommy's words would have stung and filled him with doubt. Now they just sounded petty and jealous. "Thunder's earned every dollar we've made," Jake said calmly. "Maybe you should tell your boss that before. He calls my work overpriced." Tommy's grin faltered slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means William Garrett called my office yesterday asking for a quote on some timber work his regular contractors can't handle," Jake explained. "Seems like those small horses he's so proud of aren't quite up to the job." The color drained from Tommy's face. He clearly had no idea that his boss was considering hiring the man he'd spent months mocking. Before Tommy could respond, Jake's phone rang. He answered it without stepping away, making it clear he considered the conversation. With Tommy finished, "Morrison Heavy Logging, this is Jake." "Jake, it's Frank Morrison again. I've got another job for you, but this one's different. It's a showcase project for the Forest Service. They want to film your horse working for a documentary about sustainable logging practices. The pay is double your usual rate, and it'll be great publicity for your business." Jake felt a warm surge of pride. "We'd be honored to do it, Frank. When do you need us?" "Next week, and Jake?" "They specifically requested you and Thunder. Word has gotten all the way to Washington about what you two can do." After Jake hung up, Tommy was still standing there, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "The Forest Service?" Tommy asked weakly. "That's right," Jake said, continuing up the courthouse steps. "They want to feature Thunder in a documentary about the future of logging." By the time Jake finished his paperwork and drove home, news of the Forest Service contract had already reached the local coffee shop, the feed store, and probably half the county. In a small town, good news traveled almost as fast as gossip. Jake pulled into his driveway to find an unexpected visitor waiting by Thunder's paddock. William Garrett himself was leaning against the fence, studying Thunder with the calculating expression of a man trying to figure out how much something was worth. "Evening, Garrett," Jake said as he got out of his truck. "Jake," Garrett replied, tipping his expensive hat. "Heard you've been doing well for yourself. Can't complain." Garrett gestured toward Thunder, who was grazing peacefully in the evening light. The big horse had filled out beautifully over the past 6 months. Regular work and good feed had turned him into an even more magnificent animal than he'd been at the auction. "That's quite a horse you've got there," Garrett said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll admit I might have been hasty in my judgment." "When you first bought him," Jake almost smiled. William Garrett admitting he was wrong about anything was like seeing a unicorn. "He's turned out better than I hoped," Jake said simply. "I've been thinking," Garrett continued, shifting uncomfortably. "A horse like that, with the reputation he's building, he's probably worth quite a bit of money now." Jake felt his jaw clench. He knew exactly where this conversation was heading. "I might be interested in making you an offer," Garrett said. "Something substantial. Enough for you to buy several good horses and really expand your operation." "Thunders." "Not for sale," Jake said firmly. "Now, don't be hasty," Garrett pressed. "I'm talking about serious money here. 10 times what you paid for him, maybe more." Jake looked at Thunder, who had wandered over to the fence when he heard voices. The big horse nuzzled Jake's hand gently, and Jake scratched behind his ears the way Thunder liked. "Mr. Garrett, you could offer me $1 million, and the answer would still be no. Thunder's not just a business asset. He's my partner." Garrett's friendly facade began to crack. "Be practical, Morrison. That horse won't work forever. You'd be smart to cash. And while his value is at its peak. His value to me has nothing to do with money, Jake replied. But thanks for the offer. Garrett stood up straighter, clearly not used to being turned down. You're making a mistake, boy. I'm offering you more money than you'll see in 10 years. Of logging work, maybe, Jake said. But I've learned that the best things in life aren't always the ones that make the most financial sense. As Garrett drove away in his expensive truck, Jake couldn't help but think about how different this conversation would have gone 6 months ago. Back then, an offer like that might have been tempting simply because Jake had been so desperate for money. Now, with his business thriving and his future secure, he could afford to make decisions based on what felt right rather than what paid the most. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people who had called him foolish for spending his last dollars on Thunder were now trying to buy the horse for amounts that would have solved all of Jake's problems back then. But Thunder had already solved those problems, and in the process, he'd given Jake something much more valuable than money. He'd given him back his self-respect and his future. That evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching Thunder graze in, the fading light, his phone rang again. This time it was a reporter from a national magazine that covered the logging industry. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling about a story we're writing on innovative logging techniques. Your name keeps coming up. In our interviews, would you be available for a feature article? Jake smiled as he watched Thunder roll in the dirt, the big horse as playful as a colt despite his enormous size. I'd be happy to talk, Jake said. But you should know, the real star of this story isn't me, it's my horse. That's exactly why. We want to do the story, the reporter replied. In an age of machines and technology, you've proven that sometimes the old ways are still the best ways. After hanging up, Jake walked out to the paddock where Thunder was waiting by the gate. The big horse had developed a habit of coming over whenever Jake's phone rang, as if he sensed that each call meant more opportunities for them to work together. Looks like we're going to be famous, big guy, Jake said, offering Thunder a carrot from his pocket. Thunder crunched the carrot thoughtfully, then gently bumped Jake's shoulder with his nose. It was a gesture Jake had come to recognize as Thunder's way of saying everything was going to be just fine. Looking back at his old cabin across the property, the tiny, leaking structure where he'd lived when he brought Thunder home, Jake marveled at how much had changed. But the most important change wasn't in his bank account or his living situation. The most important change was that he'd learned to trust his instincts, even when everyone else thought he was crazy. 1 year after Jake bought Thunder at the county auction, his life had settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined. Morrison Heavy Logging Services was booked solid for the next 18 months, with companies from 3 states calling for Thunder's services. Jake had turned down more high-paying jobs than he'd ever dreamed of having, simply because he couldn't be in 2 places at once. It was a crisp October morning when everything changed again. Jake was in his office, a real office in a building he owned, when his secretary knocked on the door. Jake, there's a woman here to see you. Says she's from some horse registry organization. She seems pretty excited about something. Jake looked up from the contracts he'd been reviewing. Horse registry? I didn't call anyone about registering Thunder. She says it's about Thunder's bloodline. Something about photographs she saw in that magazine article last month. The magazine article had been a big deal, a 6-page feature in National Logging Today with photos of Thunder moving massive logs through mountain terrain. Jake had been proud of how the pictures captured Thunder's incredible strength and intelligence. But he couldn't imagine why they would interest a horse registry. The woman waiting in Jake's reception area was elderly but sharp-eyed, with the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of working with valuable animals. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Reynolds from the American Draft Horse Heritage Foundation. Mr. Morrison, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. But when I saw the photographs of your horse in that magazine, I had to come see him in person. Thunder's out in the paddock if you'd like to take a look. Jake offered, still puzzled about why she was there. Dr. Reynolds followed Jake outside. But the moment she laid eyes on Thunder, her entire demeanor changed. The professional composure, Disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like shock. "My God," she whispered, pulling out a thick folder from her briefcase. "It really is him, ma'am?" Jake asked, growing concerned. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Reynolds was flipping through papers in her folder, her hands actually shaking with excitement. "Mr. Morrison, do you have any documentation about this horse's breeding? Any papers from when you purchased him?" "And just the auction receipt," Jake said. "The auctioneer said he came from a carnival that went out of business. There weren't any registration papers." "That's because the papers were stolen," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and amazement. "Mr. Morrison, this horse was reported missing from a breeding facility in Kentucky 2 years ago. His real name is Thunder Mountain King, and he's one of the most valuable draft horses in North America." Jake felt like the ground had shifted under his feet. "Valuable? What do you mean?" Dr. Reynolds opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed a magnificent black Clydesdale that looked exactly like Thunder, standing next to a banner that read National Champion Stallion Thunder Mountain King. "This horse," she said, pointing to the photo, "is the grandson of the legendary stallion Black Mountain Thunder, who was considered the finest Clydesdale of his generation. Thunder Mountain King's bloodline can be traced back to the original Clydesdale horses imported from Scotland in the 1800s. Jake stared at the photograph, then at Thunder, who was grazing peacefully, completely unaware that his entire identity was being rewritten. The breeding facility where he was stolen from had him insured for $250,000, Dr. Reynolds continued. But his actual value for breeding purposes was estimated at closer to $500,000. Jake's legs suddenly felt weak. $500,000? Possibly more now that he's proven himself as a working horse. Draft horse breeding has become extremely selective, and a stallion with Thunder's bloodline and demonstrated abilities would be worth a fortune to the right buyers. Jake sank onto a nearby fence post, trying to process what he was hearing. The horse he bought for $150, the horse everyone had laughed at him for purchasing, was actually worth more than most people's houses. How? Did he end up at a carnival? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Reynolds' expression darkened. The theft was an inside job. Someone with access to the facility forged papers showing that Thunder had died of colic. They then sold him to a livestock dealer who apparently had connections to the carnival circuit. By the time the real theft was discovered, Thunder had disappeared into a world where nobody asks too many questions about paperwork. "What happens now?" Jake asked, a terrible fear growing in his chest. "Do you have to take him back?" Dr. Reynolds smiled for the first time since arriving. "Mr. Morrison, you purchased Thunder in good faith from a legitimate auction. The insurance company has already paid out the claim to the original owners, which means legally, Thunder belongs to you. But I suspect they'd be very interested in discussing breeding rights." "Breeding rights?" With Thunder's proven genetics and his demonstrated intelligence and working ability, he could sire foals that would be worth $50,000 to $100,000 each. The original breeding facility would probably pay you a substantial amount just for the right to collect breeding material. Jake looked at Thunder again, trying to wrap his mind around the numbers Dr. Reynolds was throwing around. The horse who had saved his life was apparently worth enough money to buy a small ranch? "There's something else," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice growing even more excited. Thunder's grandfather, Black Mountain Thunder, was famous not just for his size and strength, but for his intelligence. Stories about that horse's problem-solving abilities became legendary in the draft horse world. Apparently that intelligence has been passed down. Jake thought about all the times Thunder had seemed to understand exactly what was needed, how he'd solved problems that had stumped experienced loggers, how he seemed to anticipate Jake's needs before Jake even knew what they were. The carnival people probably had no idea what they had, Dr. Reynolds continued. To them, he was just a big horse good for giving rides to children. They probably thought his unusual intelligence was just a quirky personality trait. Over the next hour, Dr. Reynolds explained the full extent of Thunder's heritage. His bloodline included champions going back 5 generations. His great-great-grandfather had been a royal favorite in Scotland before being brought to America. The genetic lines that had produced Thunder represented decades of careful breeding by people who understood the value of combining strength, intelligence, and gentle temperament. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Reynolds said as she prepared to leave, "you may have made the greatest horse purchase in modern history. The combination of price, value, and the circumstances involved, it's like something out of a fairy tale." After Dr. Reynolds left, Jake sat alone in his paddock with Thunder, trying to process everything he'd learned. The horse worth $500,000 nuzzled his shoulder gently, just like he had that first night when Jake was broke and desperate. "Did you know?" Jake asked Thunder quietly. "Did you somehow know who you really were?" Thunder's response was to rest his massive head on Jake's shoulder. The same gesture of trust and partnership he'd shown from their very first meeting. Jake's phone started ringing. Word was already spreading about Dr. Reynolds' visit. The first call was from a breeding facility in Texas offering to pay Jake $200,000 just for Thunder's breeding services over the next 5 years. The second call was from a collector in California wanting to buy Thunder outright for $750,000. Jake listened to each offer politely, then gave the same answer he'd given William Garrett months earlier. Thunder wasn't for sale, but now Jake had options he'd never imagined. He could negotiate breeding contracts that would make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams while still keeping Thunder as his working partner. He could pick and choose the most prestigious facilities, ensuring that Thunder's offspring would carry on the legendary bloodline. As the sun set over his property, Jake sat watching Thunder graze and marveled at the incredible journey they'd shared. A year ago, he'd been a broke cowboy willing to risk everything on a horse nobody else wanted. Now, he owned one of the most valuable horses in the world, a thriving business, and a future full of possibilities he could never have imagined. But the most amazing part wasn't the money or the recognition or even Thunder's incredible heritage. The most amazing part was that Jake had trusted his instincts when everyone else thought he was crazy, and that trust had led him to exactly where he was supposed to be. Thunder lifted his head from the grass and looked at Jake with those same intelligent, gentle eyes that had first caught Jake's attention at the auction. In that moment, Jake realized that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as problems that nobody else wants to solve. "Come on, big guy," Jake sighed, standing up and brushing off his jeans. "Let's go home." Thunder followed Jake toward the barn, and Jake couldn't help but smile. Whether Thunder was worth $50 or $5 million didn't really matter. What mattered was that they'd found each other when they both needed it most, and together, they'd proven that sometimes the best investments are the ones that everyone else thinks are impossible.